Now we're going to start to explore systems for which to create juggling, and we're going to have methods of how to invent new techniques and have a process which will strengthen not only the creativity but also your technique and how technique is learned. So we're going to have a process about learning how to learn, and part of this is going to go back to my system of what juggling is, because juggling is in 3 parts for me. It's about the objects, the body, and rhythm. And hopefully my system is so complete that I can put any sort of juggling in the world into my system and have it make sense. And in this way, I want to have a map of what is juggling. So all the juggling in the world is going to be in my little system, and I'm going to have a map of what the juggling looks like, of everything that's possible in the world. But the reason I want to have this map, and the reason I have my system, isn't to try to understand what we've already done. So let's say I have ball juggling here, and I have club juggling here, and I have cane juggling, and I have diablos and yo-yos and kendama or whatever. Let's say I have this big map of objects and techniques and categories and contexts and intentions and everything. The reason I want to have this isn't to understand exactly what we've done, but it's to understand what we haven't done. So in that way, maybe I have on my juggling system, I start to define everything we've done so far. And I say, okay, we've done this with clubs and we've done this with balls, but in between the clubs and the balls there's this huge blank area. And I want to try to discover what's missing. So in this way I want to have a system of juggling, not to have it documented what juggling we know, but to fill in the gaps of all the juggling that we don't know. And in that way I've made this idea of a juggling system which maybe points out areas of juggling that we haven't explored yet. And that's really hard to do, because normally if we're trying to define something, or we're trying to make a system for something, we can only catalog or categorize things that exist. We can say, okay, there's club juggling and there's ball juggling, but is there something missing? That's really harder to know. You have to take a bigger viewpoint to kind of zoom out and look at an overview and say, oh, actually, when you look at juggling in this way, there's a missing piece right in the middle of there. And that's what I really like to work on in my life with a lot of the things I try to do. Is I try to see, is there a missing link in between these 2 things we already know. So in that way I have a system of juggling, and hopefully everything that we know fits in the system, and the system is large enough that it has also holes and gaps that we can fill in. And I think those are, for me personally, the most interesting places to explore. They're also the easiest to explore because nobody's done it before, because it didn't exist yet. So talking about the system of juggling, again, we have 3 parts. There's the objects, body, and rhythm. And they're normally in this order because objects are what we start with juggling. It means that objects are, what object are we using? So is it a ball? Is it a club? Is it a ring? Is it a diablo? Is it a devil stick? Is it a cigar box? So objects are, what are we juggling? It's also in terms of what, is it a ball? It means, what color is it? Or what is it made out of? What type of ball? This is a Russian ball. Is it a bouncing ball? Is it a stage ball? Is it a wooden ball? Maybe it's made out of metal. Maybe it has an off-center of gravity somehow. Maybe it's filled with water. What temperature is it? Is it hot to touch? Is it cold? What properties does it have when I interact with it with my body? Or with the other objects of it? Is it magnetic? If I have 2 objects, what are they? Are they magnetic? Do they attach together? So in the objects there's normally what is the object? And there's so many possibilities. Even there's so many possibilities we don't traditionally explore. Right? We always have the Russian ball, it's made of plastic. We have the club that's from Henry's or from Babash, the rings or whatever. But we can have balls that are made of metal. Have we ever had a ball that's made of half wood and half metal? And what would that mean? Would it do us any good? What could we do with that? So already in terms of what the object is, there's a lot to explore. But also with objects, in the first category, it means not only what, but it means how many. So is it 1 ball, or is it 7 balls, or is it 7 club back crosses? And then that gets into, back crosses means, what are they doing? So we have, what is the object? How many are there? And then what is it doing? It means, what's the pattern of the object? For example, 7 club back crosses. The clubs are all going behind my back. And this is what we normally think about with juggling. So we have the 3 parts of juggling, and objects are the easiest because it's what we are normally starting with in our lives. We're really concerned with, are the balls going in a cascade? Or are the balls going in a shower? Or the Mills mess, right? That's what we all start off with juggling, is what is the pattern that the balls are doing. And in that way, a pattern, going back to this idea of risk and intention, patterns are setting up expectations. So, for example, when we did the exercise, the task, where you should have no risk, or it should be impossible to drop, what we're actually doing is we're setting up expectations for somebody viewing us. And when I ask each of you, and I say, was it juggling, was it risk, yes or no, you're telling me what you saw. You're telling me that I gave an expectation to you, and how did you react to that? So in one way, to do a task such as juggle and have no risk, or juggle where it's impossible to drop, perhaps one way you could try to do it and succeed in that way, succeed in the way that everybody agrees with you, is that you would do juggling that has no rhythm, no obvious pattern, and no obvious technique. It means maybe some sort of improvisation, but at the same time, even an improvisation has an intention. So you have to have a hidden intention in terms of an erratic or an undiscernible rhythm or an unrecognizable pattern, and maybe also a technique that people don't understand. And that way, maybe you could juggle without any risk or without it being possible to drop, because the audience wouldn't know if you were going to do that or not. At the same time, they might also not know that you're juggling. So that brings the definition back to the idea of what is juggling. But I think it definitely is possible, in terms of all the examples we saw in our group today, that everybody set up patterns. For example, Jean Isham set up this pattern here. Saska set up a pattern of square on the floor. Everything had a very clear shape. Everything had a very clear rhythm. And in that way, if we break the shape and we break the rhythm, maybe it's harder for the audience to understand what they're looking at and to say if there was risk or if they were dropping or not, because there wasn't that intention behind the work that was so obvious. But everybody today made the intention very concrete and very clear, rhythmically and in terms of the pattern. But patterns, it's the objects, and that's what we normally spend, 99% of our lives with juggling. I think we're worried about the objects. What are they? How many are they? What are they doing? That's all. But then we can look at the second category of juggling, which is the body. And the body, very simply, this sounds really stupid to say, but it's good to say things that are obvious. The body is how the objects are moved. So if in the first category of objects we're concerned with what pattern are the objects doing, well, those patterns exist because of how our bodies are moving. And there's a controversial idea, whether you agree with it or not, it's funny to think about, from Jérôme Thomas in France, who says, for example, you can change the body instead of changing the objects to get new patterns. So for example, with the objects, if I'm going to do a pattern, I say, here's the cascade. And if I want to make a new pattern, I change the objects. And now I have a new trick, a new pattern. But if we take this idea from Jérôme Thomas in France, and we keep the objects the same, but we change the body, then I start with my cascade, and I say, now I'm going to keep the cascade the same, the objects are the same, the number of objects and what they're doing is the same, but the body will change. Now I have a new pattern, now I have a new trick, and now back to the other trick, or now I have a new trick, or now I have a new trick, or even now I have a new trick. Right? So the objects didn't change, but my body changed. And some people argue if that's juggling or not, in the same way that Jerome likes to say sometimes that juggling is this, juggling can be this, with no objects, it's just the movement of the body. I'm not going to get into that argument for now, but it's something to think about, that at least you can agree with me that the objects can stay the same and the body can change. Whether it's a new trick or not, it doesn't really matter. It is certainly very useful, and you all know that, you've had in your lives. You're going to change your body somehow, even just technically, when you're juggling, you're going to change your body somehow to do a new trick. So somehow you're going to change, you're going to lift your leg, or you're going to turn your hands over, or you're going to turn your head. So technically even, moving the body is very useful. Normally when you move the body, you're also moving the objects at the same time, but you don't have to. And that's why in my system, I feel it's important to separate them out. I think it's really useful to separate those two things out and look at them independently, which we're going to do later on in class. So we're going to look just at the objects alone, then we're going to look at just the body alone. Again, a lot of these ideas we've done our whole lives intuitively and naturally, but they've always been really integrated and we don't really think about it. There's a lot of value in separating them out and just looking at juggling outside of performance, or just looking at the body on its own, and not having everything have to deal with everything together. It's the same thing when you learn to juggle. You don't just take 3 balls straight away and just try to do 3 balls. It's normally too confusing. You start with 1 ball and you break it down and you add the other balls in. It's the same thing for this system. And the last part of juggling is rhythm. And for me, rhythm is the most important thing out of it all. Because rhythm is how the objects in the body interact with each other. And I have a really great example. It means that rhythmically, when I catch this ball, it means I'm going to throw the ball, and the ball in my hand will be in the same space at the same time. Rhythmically, right? So they come to the same place in the same time, and I catch the ball. But if I throw the ball, and it goes to the same place, but at a different time than the hand, then I drop the ball. And it's really that simple. I mean, it's so stupid, but it's true. Rhythm is how it's possible to catch. So to have rhythm, it means the objects in the body interact with each other in a productive way. And again, 99% of our technical problems with juggling is because of rhythm. People say all the time, what's wrong with my 5-ball cascade? Can you help me with my 5-club cascade? What's wrong with my 7 rings? Or whatever. It's normally 99% of the time it's rhythm. If you fix the rhythm, you fix the way the objects in the body are interacting together, and then you're going to have a nice pattern. But each of these categories break down into 3 more categories that are kind of related to each other. So for the objects, we have the object's relationship to other objects. We have the object's relationship to the body. And we have the object's relationship to the environment. And what that means is, inside of juggling, we have one object that's, let's say, doing a normal throw like this. And the next object, if we're doing a cascade, normally goes underneath it, or we could say on the interior. Or, if I want to relate this object to the other object, instead of on the interior, I could throw it on the exterior. It means, instead of doing a cascade, I do a reverse cascade. Not a big deal, but that's obviously a whole category. The objects' relationships to other objects. As well, we have objects' relationships to the body. So it means, for example, is the ball, do we have a throw that's normal like that? Or do we have a throw that's going under that catching hand? Or do we have a ball that's coming reverse on the other side? So body throws are very easy to understand. How does the object relate to the body? The same thing can be said for a pirouette. So the ball was relating to the body in the way that the ball stayed in place in one way, and the body turned in relationship to the ball. We have that relationship. How is the body and the ball and the object relating to each other? And then finally we have the object's relationship to the environment. And that's also very easy to understand. So again, is the ball being thrown very high? So it's going farther away from the floor or whatever, closer to the ceiling? That's also a big relationship we deal with all the time. We always say, especially for performers, if you're going to perform juggling, you come into a theater, for example, and you say, how high is the ceiling? That's really clearly the object's relationship to the environment. But that's also a pretty mundane definition. And in other ways, of course, you can say, well, the ball, you can bounce it off the wall, or the ball is being rolled on the wall in my arm, or we can roll the ball on the floor, we can bounce the ball off the floor, we can bounce the ball off of the table. So how does the object relate to the environment? And we can make use of that technically. Then as well, the body has 3 parts, and it is the body's relationship to the body, the body's relationship to objects, and the body's relationship to the environment. And let's look at this really fast. It's pretty simple, obviously. The body's relationship to the body means very simply, well, if I'm going to have my hands like this and do some juggling, or am I going to relate to my arms like this? So my one arm is here, and my one arm is here. Or also, really importantly, what's the difference between this and this, in which I spent 1 year of my life working on, and I got about over 160 tricks out of that alone, to try to figure out, is there a trick that needs the arms to be like this, or do they need to be like this? And we'll look at some of that later on as well. So the body's relationship to the body also can be, obviously, is my elbow connected to my knee for no reason? How do I juggle like this? And also we talk about the body's relationship to the body when we're talking about classical juggling technique. You talk about Russian technique, you have your golden points, your 3-finger space between your elbow and your ribs and your shoulders here and your head and your center of gravity and your whole, yeah, you can have your Gato technique or whatever, he was always slightly off or something. So yeah, the body's relationship to the body isn't just artistic, it's also practical and technical. Then we have the body's relationship to objects, and you could say, if you wanted to, but what's the difference? We had objects to body, and now we're doing body to objects. Is there any difference in that? And for me, there is. For example, in the first case over here, the object's relationship to the body, we have the object in focus as a starting point. So in this case, as this example, we can say that the object is normally on top of the body. And that's definitely what we traditionally look at when we look at objects. But over here we can say the body is in focus, and the relationship is going in this direction, that the body is first and the objects come next. So there we could start to say that the body is on top of objects, which we never really explore so much with juggling. There's some really nice club juggling patterns where the body is on top of the clubs. And again, there hasn't been a lot of work done with this, and it's a pretty small technical detail of objects on top of bodies or bodies on top of objects, but it's also a pretty interesting one. I don't think we've looked at very much. And finally, we have the body's relationship to the environment. Again, that's really straightforward. So am I standing up? Am I sitting down, juggling? Am I laying down on my back on the floor? Am I leaning against the wall and doing some juggling like this? How does the body and the environment go together? And finally, we have rhythm. Rhythm has 3 parts. It means rhythm looks like this. We have the long dwell time. We have a short dwell time. And we have no dwell time. What that means is dwell time. Again, this is a really terrible word to use for what we're talking about, but it's what we have. So dwell means to rest or to stay. So dwell time means, in common language, dwell time means how long you hold onto the ball with your hand before it's thrown again. But as we discovered earlier, all those words I just said are meaningless. How long I hold onto the ball? Well, I don't have to hold it anymore with my hand, and I don't have to throw it anymore. So how do we describe this with our current techniques? So what we can say is, a long dwell time talks about the maximum amount of time that an object is kept out of the rotation in terms of the order of the relationship of the objects that are being manipulated. Yeah, it sucks to say, and it sucks to try to understand. Basically, in a very simple way, if we look at the 3-ball cascade, a long dwell time means if I do my cascade, I'm going to try to hold on to that ball as long as I can before throwing it again, without changing the height of the pattern. Because of course, if I juggle like normal, and I want to have a longer dwell time, one of the easier things to do to make it longer is just to give you higher throws. You have more time, right? So then I'm holding onto the ball for a longer time. But I can change the dwell time without changing the height of the pattern. And I just slow down. And I try to hold the ball as long as I can before I have to move it again. So then, conversely, we have the short dwell time. It's the exact opposite, of course. It means without changing the height of the pattern, because if I change the height of the pattern lower, then of course I have a shorter dwell time. I move the ball faster in relationship to the other balls. So if I keep the pattern the same height, and then I just throw faster, this is a short dwell time. Right, and it's so short I have some space, I can even snap my fingers. So we have long dwell time, short dwell time, and then we have no dwell time, which is really strange. And this gets a bit complicated, but basically no dwell time is a balance. Because a balance talks about rhythm in such a different way than the rest of juggling that I count it as something completely different. And the thing about a balance, if I can have a club, is that, in a balance, in order for it to stay balanced, it has to be moving all the time. And if I move all the time so fast and so much, it appears that the club doesn't move. But in fact, if I stop moving, then the club falls. It's not in balance. So the rhythm of the technique is really strange. And the way I have to have constant movement, but of course then there isn't any movement if I'm succeeding in moving constantly. So we have a really strange relationship of rhythm in that way. How do you count that? It's so far removed from the other types of techniques in terms of how to count the rhythm internally in the structure of the pattern or the structure of the technique that I give it its own category. And it's called no dwell time. And finally, each of these subcategories, these 9 subcategories, they each have 2 more categories. So that's 18 more categories, but they're really easy. So all of these have a similar one, the same as all of these, and then these 2 as well. And these things all point to that we can have a physical relationship or a spatial relationship. And let me tell you what that means. So, if we look at an object-to-object relationship, it means that, for example, this ball can pass on the interior of the other ball, or it can pass on the exterior of the other ball, if I do cascade, or I do reverse cascade. Or even to make it more simple, I can say that this ball in my right hand is above the ball in my left hand. But these relationships can take place in 2 different ways. The first way is physically. So physically, this ball can be on top of the other ball, and in that way it means they're physically touching. The ball in my right hand is literally on top of the ball in my left hand. It's touching it, so it's on top. However, we could also take that same relationship and say that it's in space. Spatially, space. So then I just say, okay, the ball in my right hand is on top of the left hand, but it's just in space, it's in concept. It's in the environment, it's not actually touching. That's all it means. So all of these relationships means that they're either the objects or the body are touching or not touching. You could say, to break it down more simply. Again, if you take a body to environment, physically, I'm touching the wall. So maybe I'm leaning on the wall. So maybe I have some sort of technique I can't do, that I don't have my weight on my leg. I can have it up here and do something for a long time. I don't know. Or then I can say, okay, the body and the environment, in terms of space, where am I? Okay, I'm really far away from the audience, or I'm really far away from something I'm bouncing a ball off of, or I'm really close to it. Again, I'm touching it, or I'm just, my relationship to it in space. Where are we? Because that's what we're doing with juggling normally, is we're designing movement in space. We're designing the movements of objects in terms of space and time. Same thing here with rhythm, long dwell time or short dwell time. To have a long dwell time, like I said before, I can take my throw and I can just make it higher. And then the object that's below it, for example, the one that's next in line, I'll hold on to it much longer before I throw it again. But we don't have to have long dwell times always just be in space. So what I just showed you was that I have a spatial relationship in terms of my dwell time. I have the object before it, I give a higher throw. But also we can do, for example, a physical long dwell time. It means I can do a really high throw, I can do a pinch or a trap, and wait for that throw to come down. Basically, again, I'm counting my internal rhythm. And this is a really, really high throw, so I'm holding on to this for a really long time, and now it's coming down, so then I can throw the ball again. Same thing for a short dwell time. I can have a really short dwell time. For example, instead of doing a normal throw, I could maybe do a placement on the head. And this placement on the head takes a shorter time than, say, even a normal throw. So that the ball that comes after the normal throw, I don't even hold it as long, I have to throw it sooner. We have a short dwell time, physical or spatial. But then we have the last one, the no dwell time. And it has its own little category here. And it is called active or passive. And those are types of balances. So we have an active balance, again, like I showed with the club. An active balance means I'm balancing all the time, and I have to actively look at the object, or even actively feel the object, and I have to adjust accordingly. But you can also have a passive balance. And a passive balance, for example, is a balance where the ball is balanced, but I don't have to take care of it 100% of the time. I can turn my attention elsewhere, but if I move a little bit, it falls. So it's still a balance in that way, but I don't have to all the time be moving. And of course, you can start to argue, if you want, what is the difference between a passive balance and, say, a trap or a hold or a pinch or a placement or a roll. And we can get into that later, and maybe you're right. But for now, we have active balances and passive balances. And in terms of that, we have the whole system of juggling. The three main parts, each of those three main parts have the three subparts of that, and then each of those parts have either these other two, physical, spatial, or an active or passive balance. And we're going to start now to do some juggling together. We're going to start with objects.